Okay, seriously, a name like Jesse James Hollywood, I mean, come on. You almost have to laugh. Like,
It's like something out of a movie.
exactly. And trust me, this deep dive is way more twisted than any movie. We're talking about a case that rocks sunny West Hills, California back in 2000.
Yeah.
Think palm trees, swimming pools, the whole American dream facade.
Which makes what happens even more unsettling, right?
Right, like you think you know your neighbors, your kids are safe riding bikes, and then, bam, a 15-year-old named Nick Markowitz gets snatched in broad
It's
daylight.
gone.
Gone. And this is where it gets wild. This isn't some silent hostage situation. Nick ends up at parties, even a motel pool, hanging out with the guys who took him.
It's a glimpse into that strange psychology of captivity, especially with a group of young guys involved. Almost this sense of, maybe this isn't so bad.
Of course.
But of course it was. And meanwhile, you've got the ringleader, our namesake, Jesse James Hollywood, starting to freak out.
Because he's realizing this whole kidnapping thing comes with some serious consequences.
Exactly. And the lawyer he goes to, let's just say this lawyer knew the darker corners of the legal system.
Which tells you something about the circles Jesse James Hollywood was already moving in, right?
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just some kid who sold some weed on the side. He was in deep, and it was about to get a whole lot deeper.
So picture this. The pressure's mounting, Nick's still missing, and Jesse James Hollywood. He sees a way out, a terrifying, cold-blooded way out. He turns to another guy in his crew, Ryan Hoyt, who just so happens to owe him a hefty sum.
And here's where those power dynamics, that almost cult-like influence, really come into play. Jesse James Hollywood wasn't just giving an order, he was offering a twisted form of salvation. Take care of this Nick problem, he tells Ryan, and you're free and clear.
Free and clear. Man, that's chillin'.
It is.
So Ryan Hoyt, the so-called follower in all this, he agrees, and they drive Nick Markowitz up to the Santa Barbara Mountains. What happened next? Let's just say those details are rough, even for seasoned deep dive listeners.
What's striking is just how quickly this escalated from a debt collection to something so much darker. You have to wonder, at what point did they cross that line where there was no turning back?
Right. And the thing that gets me is Ryan Hoyt's chilling words later. All I did was shoot him 9 times. He shot a 15-year-old kid 9 times. Just senseless.
And it's a stark reminder that sometimes the most disturbing truths are found not in the elaborate schemes, but in the chilling simplicity of those final moments. This wasn't a movie shootout. It was a brutal execution.
And with that, Jesse James Hollywood disappears, vanishes. For 4 years, this guy goes off the grid. I mean, we're talking monasteries, beaches in Brazil, the whole 9 yards. It's almost comical.
knows?
Except for the fact that a kid is dead.
Mm-hmm.
And this guy's living it up like a character in one of those very movies he seemed to idolize.
That's the thing about this case. It's full of these strange echoes, these reflections of a life lived in the shadow of a romanticized criminal underworld. But even more fascinating is how this escapism, this desire to live out a fantasy, ultimately leads to his downfall.
Wait, what do you mean? How does he finally get caught?
Let's just say the authorities had a little help. And it came from a surprising source, his own father.
His own father?
Yeah.
Seriously, what was he doing sending postcards from Rio?
Not quite, but close. Phone taps. You see, the authorities had his father's phone tapped. And let's just say those calls painted a pretty clear picture of Jesse James Hollywood's whereabouts.
So dear old dad was a little more involved in this escape than he let on.
A little. And that's not even the craziest part.
Oh, there's more.
Brazil. Turns out Jesse James Hollywood didn't just find refuge there. He started a family.
No way.
Yeah, a son, John Paul. And listen, this wasn't just a fling, right? He was trying to pull a page right out of the Ronnie Biggs playbook.
Ronnie Biggs, who's that? Some kind of a criminal mastermind or something.
Oh, you could say that. Biggs was this notorious British robber who pulled off the Great Train Robbery back in the 60s, escaped prison, lived it up in Brazil for years. And get this, he avoided extradition because he had a kid there.
Wow.
So it seems Jesse James Hollywood figured, hey, if it worked for Biggs, might as well give it a shot.
Except, I'm guessing things didn't quite go according to plan.
Not exactly. Times had changed a little bit. Extradition laws had tightened up. But you see, it just adds another layer to this whole life imitating art thing, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The irony is this attempt to recreate a Hollywood ending is, well, it's precisely what brings him down.
Wow. So they nab him in Brazil. They ship him back to the U.S. What's the scene like when he finally faces trial?
Well, 2007, the trial begins. And let me tell you, that courtroom, it was electric. You had the media, the families, the sheer weight of this whole case. You could just feel it. And you had the prosecution painting Jesse James Hollywood as, as this manipulative mastermind who orchestrated this whole thing.
But wasn't his defense that he wasn't even there for the actual murder?
Exactly. His lawyers, they hammered that point home. He didn't pull the trigger. He wasn't present at the scene, they said. They tried to paint him as, just a kid in over his head, caught up in something he couldn't control.
And what about Ryan Hoyt, the guy who actually did pull the trigger?
His defense was interesting, to say the least. They argued that Jesse James Hollywood had, brainwashed him, coerced him, right? They brought up this concept of coercive persuasion, how someone, in a position of power can manipulate others to do their bidding.
So which narrative did the jury buy? Did they see Jesse James Hollywood as the mastermind, or just another lost soul swept up in a bad situation?
Well, after weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for days. And the tension, you could cut it with a knife,
I bet.
And then on July 8th, 2009, the verdict came in. Guilty. Guilty of kidnapping and first-degree murder with special circumstances.
Special circumstances? What does that even mean?
In this case, it meant that the murder was committed during the commission of the kidnapping.
Right.
And it meant that the death penalty was on the table.
Man, talk about high stakes. So what happened? Did they go for the death penalty?
Well, that decision, that burden, fell on the jury. And let me tell you, that courtroom was a sea of emotions during the penalty phase. The mothers of both Jesse James Hollywood and Nick Markowitz took the stand.
No.
Imagine that, right? Two mothers forever linked by this tragedy, pleading for their sons. One for his life, the other for justice.
Man, that must have been incredibly powerful. What a heavy, heavy decision for that jury to make. So what did they decide?
After what seemed like an eternity, the jury reached a verdict. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jesse James Hollywood would spend the rest of his days behind bars.
And what about the others involved? Any justice for them?
Ryan Hoyt, the one who pulled the trigger, he was initially sentenced to death, though that was later commuted to life in prison as well. The others involved received, lighter sentences for their roles in the crime.
So in a way, the story comes full circle, but there's still this feeling of, what if? What if Jesse James Hollywood had never gone down that path? What if Nick Markowitz had never crossed paths with that group?
It's those what-ifs that make this case so haunting, so relevant even after all these years. It forces us to confront the randomness of fate, the fragility of life, and the devastating consequences that can unfold from a series of, seemingly small choices.
Really makes you question that whole notion of justice, doesn't it? Like, is a life sentence ever truly enough to balance the scales when a young life has been taken?
It's a question that lingers long after the verdicts are read, the sentences handed down, and it speaks to a larger truth about these kinds of cases, There are no easy answers, there are no neat resolutions, just a profound sense of loss. And the echoes of choices made, both big and small, that just, they reverberate through time.
Yeah, no doubt. Heavy stuff. And speaking of lingering consequences, there's that whole other layer to this case. The movie, Alpha Dog. Didn't that stir up some serious controversy?
Oh, absolutely. You see, the filmmakers, they wanted to get inside the minds of everyone involved, right?
Right.
So they actually worked with both the prosecution and the defense during production.
Oh.
Which, ethically speaking, was a minefield.
Yeah, I bet. Wait, really? How does that even work? I mean, wouldn't that bias the whole thing?
That was the million-dollar question. Could a movie, even one based on, real events, could it actually influence a jury?
Right.
Should Hollywood even be allowed to tell these kinds of stories while a trial is still ongoing? It sparked this huge debate about the intersection of art, justice, and the court of public opinion.
Man, talk about blurring the lines. And here I thought the case itself was already a twisted enough narrative. But, there's one more piece of this puzzle that really sticks with me.
Yep.
What about Jesse James Hollywood's son, John Paul? Right.
Yeah.
Growing up in Brazil, only knowing your dad is this fugitive.
Yeah.
I mean, that's got to mess you up.
It's the kind of ripple effect that, most people don't even consider. Nick Markowitz's family, obviously, their lives are shattered. But then you have these other players, these peripheral figures whose lives are forever entangled with this tragedy. The families torn apart, the friends caught in the crossfire. It's a stark reminder that these events, they leave scars that run much deeper than we often realize.
It makes you realize this wasn't just a story in the headlines, This was real life with real people grappling with the fallout.
And that's what makes a duck dive like this so important. You see, it's not about sensationalizing the crime, it's about understanding the human cost, right? The choices, the consequences, the enduring impact on everyone involved.
Absolutely. So as we wrap things up here, what do you think is the most crucial takeaway from all of this? What's the one thing you really hope listeners will ponder after they finish this deep dive?
It's tempting to try to find one clear-cut answer, one big lesson to be learned.
Right.
But the truth is, this case, it's complex, just like life is complex. What I hope listeners take away is this. Pay attention to the small choices. The ones that seem insignificant at the time, but can set in motion a chain of events with devastating consequences.
Right.
And don't underestimate the power of your own voice. If you see something wrong, if something feels off, say something. You never know how far-reaching those ripples of courage can be.
Powerful words. And sometimes the most powerful lessons are the ones that leave us with more questions than answers. This case, this story, it stays with you. It makes you think about the choices we make, the paths we choose, and the lasting impact we have on the world around us.
And sometimes that's all we can ask for, to be left with a sense of wonder,
Yeah.
a desire to learn more, to dig deeper, to question not just the events themselves, but our own place within the narrative.
Well said. To all our listeners out there, thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We'll leave you with this. Do you think justice was truly served in the case of Jesse James Hollywood? And what lessons, if any, will you carry with you from this tragic story?